Tensions between Iran and the United States have simmered since the 1979 Iranian Revolution and hostage crisis after the takeover of America's embassy in Tehran. Now, nearly 40 years later, the relationship has reached another low point. This latest standoff started in 2002 when the US and its Western allies learned that Iran was developing nuclear facilities for uranium enrichment. Washington accused Tehran of secretly making nuclear weapons. Iran denied the charge as it was slapped with crippling sanctions from the US, UN, and EU. But in 2013, Iran's new moderate president Hassan Rouhani spoke on the phone with Democratic US President Barack Obama. The first high-level discussion in more than 30 years opened doors for a deal 2 years later. The US, UK, France, China, Russia, and Germany agreed to lift economic sanctions on Iran. In turn, Iran promised to limit its nuclear activities and allow international inspectors to verify the deal. But US sanctions were still in place, and Washington was quietly moving ahead with an investigation into Tehran's business dealings with the rest of the world. And for 3 years, the US Federal Bureau of Investigation was building an Iran sanctions violations case against Chinese tech giant ZTE. In March 2016, the US Department of Commerce made its case against ZTE and threatened to cut the company off from its US suppliers for 7 years. ZTE only avoided the export restriction by agreeing to pay a $1.2 billion fine. 2 years later, ZTE was caught violating sanctions again. This time, it was blocked from US components and services it needed for its smartphones and telecoms gear. Days later, another Chinese tech giant was in trouble. Huawei was accused of violating US sanctions by selling telecommunications equipment to Iran. In December 2018, Canada bowed to a US request to detain Huawei's chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou. The daughter of Huawei's founder landed in a lengthy court battle against extradition to the US to face accusations she violated the US trade embargo on Iran. US-Iran relations had meanwhile taken a sharp turn for the worse under US President Donald Trump. In May 2018, Trump pulled the US out of the nuclear deal brokered by his predecessor, Barack Obama. He soon stepped up sanctions against Iran. The US also sent an aircraft carrier group, Air Force bombers, and troops near the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway that serves tankers carrying about 20% of the world's oil. A year later, tensions escalated further. Explosions ripped through 2 oil tankers in the nearby Gulf of Oman in June 2019. The US blamed Iran. Video released by the US military was described as showing Iranian forces near one of the ships, removing an unexploded mine to cover Tehran's tracks. Iran denied involvement and demanded that US forces withdraw from the region. A week later, Iranian forces shot down a US drone. President Trump was reportedly set to respond with a missile strike on Iran, but called it off minutes before launch. The following month, Iran's Revolutionary Guard seized a British-flagged oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, claiming it infringed maritime regulations. British Royal Marines had recently seized an Iranian supertanker off Gibraltar, claiming it was shipping oil to Syria in breach of EU sanctions. The international community has, meanwhile, tried to break the diplomatic deadlock and salvage the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. At G7 talks in August, French leader Emmanuel Macron hosted Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif for talks aimed at reaching a compromise. But Washington only continued to step up its pressure on Tehran, including steps to block Iranian shipments of oil that violate US sanctions. On September 4th, Iran's President Hassan Rouhani announced Tehran would expand its uranium enrichment work. The crisis escalated days later with a drone attack on the world's largest oil processing facility and an oil field in Saudi Arabia. Half the kingdom's oil output was disrupted, sending global energy prices soaring. Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen claim responsibility. But the US has pointed the finger squarely at Tehran, and President Trump tweeted that Washington was locked and loaded to respond. Saudi Arabia and Washington's EU allies backed up the claim, saying missile fragments found at the scene showed the attack was unquestionably sponsored by Tehran. And as Iran denied involvement, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo raised the stakes, calling the strikes an act of war. By November 2019, Iran was building a second nuclear reactor at its Bushehr power plant. The facility is fueled by uranium that was enriched beyond the limits of the crumbling 2015 deal, dashing hopes that tension in the region will ease anytime soon.